Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I'm going to welcome the participants to this session on the private and social returns to R&D and vaccine development. We have 4 papers on this topic. We're fortunate to have had a great response to putting this panel on the program this year. Of course, all eyes worldwide have been on vaccine development, and there's been an ongoing literature in economics on innovation, and in particular on pharmaceutical innovation. So we have a number of authors who have worked in this literature before, both in general and focused on developing the COVID vaccine. So the first paper will be presented by Michael Kremer.
Great, thank you so much. So this paper is the product of a large group of economists, as you can see. Many of us were involved in developing the concept of advanced market commitments for vaccines and its implementation for pneumococcus. But as you'll see, we'll argue that this problem is quite different. Let me highlight a few people who are here today. Susan Athey, Chris Snyder, Alex Tabarek, and Brandon Tan. Please jump in if I've got anything wrong there. So we're interested in the COVID-19 problem, but I think this is applicability to future pandemics as well. And central starting place for us is that there's a huge value to accelerating vaccine availability in pandemics through early investment in vaccine manufacturing and through very large scale investment. So there's a lot of capacity so people can be vaccinated more quickly. Why is that? Well, every month COVID is killing around 200,000 people globally. The economic losses are on the order of $500 billion per month, just in short-run GDP losses alone. But of course, if you value the health costs, if you think about the interruption to educational investment, businesses shutting down, the full losses are much larger. So Cutler and Summers estimate just for the United States the amount they estimate is equivalent to $890 billion each month. And the normal timeline for vaccine development is 3 to 4 years from initial testing to large-scale commercial capacity installation. And that's done only after the trials are complete, when we know whether the vaccine would work. And that's because it's a costly and difficult process. And perhaps that makes sense in normal situations. But in a situation like this one, investing early in the capacity construction at risk, and as we'll argue, even at very large scale, is socially valuable. So we estimate the social marginal value of vaccine capacity at thousands of dollars per course of capacity, per annual course of capacity. That's the social value. If you think about the private value, the deals that have been announced so far involve prices ranging from $6 per course of vaccine to maybe $40 per course of vaccine. And you can see that the social value of the vaccine far, far exceeds the private value. And the classic reason is epidemiological externalities. Individuals don't receive the full benefit from vaccines, so they won't pay the full value. But in this case, obviously governments are purchasing, and yet we still see this, even though there are a number of governments out there. And the early doses are particularly valuable. In the very short run, the supply is limited, so the price is not being bid up anywhere near the social value. We think that's probably because of either ethical or political or some sort of social constraints on pricing. Now, there may, you can debate, are those appropriate? But in any case, they're a reality. And in a situation in which there are these social limits on pricing, then there'll be underinvestment in early construction of capacity and in large-scale construction of capacity. And that suggests at least a potential case for government action to spur that investment. So we looked at the case of COVID-19. I'll tell you a little bit about our results for that. But I think, and there's still some implications for COVID-19, but we think the method can be useful for future pandemics. I'll talk about three issues. First, contract design. Second, how much should countries invest? And third, what are the international aspects of this? International trade, and is there a role for centralized coordination of procurement? So first on contract design. So the benefit of purchasing vaccine early on comes from earlier access to a vaccine. Now, if you just wrote a contract on the number of doses without specifying the delivery dates or without some teeth in the contract on when the delivery date would be, then there'll be inadequate incentives for speed. As Susan makes the analogy to anybody who's gotten work done in their home and hires a contractor, the contractor can say, sorry, it's going to take longer, and what can you do about it at that stage? Well, one thing you could do would be to put in bonuses or penalties for speed. But the size of those bonuses and penalties would have to be enormous to align private and social incentives. And of course, there are many factors outside the manufacturer control. How quickly can they get the testing done? Well, that depends how quickly people are being infected. Maybe there's an adverse event that slows them down. You couldn't go all the way to align private and social incentives. That would put too much risk on the parties. There also could be potential unintended consequences if you have too strong incentives for speed. Maybe they cut corners or hide data. And that suggests that at least part of the solution would be contracting directly on manufacturing capacity, to put it in early and to put it in at very large scale. Because otherwise, if you just contract for the number of doses, they could just provide that number of doses over a longer time with a smaller factory. That's clearly not what is in society's interest. So we suggest contracts in which you pay for capacity installation in exchange for the option to buy doses at something close to marginal cost. Second question is, who should bear the risk that the vaccine doesn't work? If you're paying for the capacity to be constructed before you know whether the vaccine will succeed, whether it will get through testing, should you structure that contract so the government pays no matter what? Or should you say, well, the government will pay more, but only if the vaccine succeeds? And if you think about pharmaceutical markets in normal times, we have a mix of NIH funding where the government pays whether independent of the result of the grant, and incentives for pharmaceutical firms to sell products, which pays based on success. So we constructed a very stylized model of the COVID-19 vaccine case. Think about an extreme case where capacity installation costs are roughly observable. You can ask the company, how much do you have to spend on putting in bioreactors and factory capacity, constructing the factory, et cetera. We'll also assume, and this is going to be extreme, that firms have private information on the probability of success. Think of this not just will the vaccine get through testing, but also can they manufacture it, for example. That might be a question for some types of vaccines. We'll also think, and this actually comes out of our model, that the buyer wants many shots on goal, that they don't just want to incentivize installation of capacity for the vaccine with the highest probability of success, or 2 or 3, but actually a lot of different vaccines. And that it's worth doing this even if it's a fairly low probability of success. So all of these characteristics in some ways differ with what we call the classic case for advanced market commitments, which some of us had worked on earlier. We were thinking about things that were actually, there was a lot of R&D that needed to be done, very hard to know what the true cost of R&D is, what's really required, what's actually just what the researcher wants, where some of the world wasn't willing to pay to get very low probability of success things going. So we wind up perhaps actually reaching very different conclusions. So if the advanced market commitment idea was to say, if somebody develops a successful malaria vaccine, we'll pay for it. Here, we wound up concluding that relying solely or even primarily on pull where the payment is only conditional on success, is more expensive and gives rents to the inframarginal candidates. So here's a toy example. Suppose every unit of capacity costs $4 to install, but the producer, we don't know whether they believe there's a 20% chance, a 10% chance, a 5% chance of success. Well, if we knew they thought there was a 20% chance of success, you'd either pay them $4 independent of whether they succeed, or pay them $20 if they succeed. These would be roughly equivalent. But if we're uncertain, if they only thought there was a 5% chance of success, then they would need an $80 pull. So if you're trying to bring in a bunch of different producers, including some with low probability of success, you'll have to offer a fairly high price. And then you're going to be making unnecessary, I'll put that in quotes, payments to the firms with private information that they have a pretty high chance of success. Now, this is obviously a crazily stylized model. We think that some pull element is desirable. You want to incentivize speed, you want to incentivize capacity. There might be some manufacturers that really know they have no chance at all, and you want to weed them out. So most of them are primarily push, but not all of them. So that's on how the contract should be designed. Second question is how much to invest. And the assumptions we made was that investing early accelerates vaccines by 3 months. If you wait till after vaccines improve to put in large-scale capacity, you lose 3 months. We actually allowed for the possibility that drugs would be developed or something else that would cut the cost of the epidemic. We got data on vaccine candidates, assigned estimates of the probability of vaccines success based on historical data, interviews, information on platforms. We made some assumptions about the correlations. I think we also made some assumptions about the cost of installing capacity. A key unknown there, to be frank, was what's the elasticity of supply? We know the price of some of the deals that were done, but what we don't know, some people were saying, it's just impossible to install a lot of capacity no matter how much money you have. It's really an elastic supply. I think our view is it turned out to be more elastic than some of those people were saying. We actually have a lot of supply, but obviously that was a very hard parameter to get at. We nonetheless, we made assumptions. And we continuously updated them. Here's an example of what we had as of August. The left-hand panel shows the probability of at least one success, depending on the number of candidates. Obviously, that's a very concave because you have enough shots on goal, and eventually you go down to lower probability vaccines. But it was still worth going very far out because the payoff to success is so high. Obviously, also there's a payoff to having multiple candidates. The right-hand panel shows what we recommended for the U.S. in terms of how much to invest in different candidates. You can see we recommended investing in a lot of candidates and a lot of capacity. That was for the U.S. What we found was that all countries would want to invest at risk. The higher income countries would invest in more candidates and more capacity. The total optimal purchases that we found at the current prices were much greater than actual investment so far. And that's robust to the value of the purchase, even if there's even if supply is relatively inelastic, you still want to go pretty far out and buy a lot. So the total value of spending we recommended was quite high relative to what was actually done. Now, so in particular, we recommended for the US as an example, 137 million courses per month. That was the expected capacity. If we'd had 2 successes from the leading candidates, according to what we're recommending then, vaccinations could have been finished in March. If you think about those Cutler and Summers numbers, $890 billion per month, this would have easily paid for the extra capacity that we argued should be put in. Now, I don't want to claim that our model necessarily got everything right. We assume fairly low probabilities of success for each candidate and fairly modest correlations. And that's why we recommended investing in a lot of different candidates. The actual realization was very favorable. There were a lot of successes, so we've got a reasonable amount of capacity now. maybe what would have been, they were ex post, what would have been optimal is fewer candidates, more capacity in each one of those candidates. But of course, we don't know we'll never know what was right. I think the important point isn't what was exactly right. The important point is this approach could be used in future pandemics, and you can get much better data with more effort, more scientists involved on what the probabilities and correlations are to come up with an appropriate portfolio. There are some current implications which I'd like to mention for this pandemic, and then before going into the international side and future pandemics. We estimate that even now, even though you'd have a delay in putting in any additional capacity, a 3 to 6 month delay, there's still enormous gains to putting in more capacity. We should be going out and going to producers and asking them for bids on putting in more capacity. The other implication is we should try to get more capacity out of what we have now. If you think about the standard approach to thinking about what's the appropriate dosage, how many doses, what's the timing of them, do you give vaccines to people who've already had the disease? The normal trade-off would be things you try to maximize the benefit to the people receiving the vaccine. So, for example, trade-off efficacy versus side effects and thinking about dosage. That's totally appropriate in normal times. The social cost of the vaccine is the manufacturing cost. That's typically much less than the price. It's basically negligible. So to first order, just maximize benefit for the individual getting the vaccine. In the pandemic, it's exactly the opposite. The shadow price of the vaccines, the value of these vaccines is huge, being able to give them to more people. So the cost is modest, but the value of the additional doses is huge. So if you could, that suggests we should at least think about, and obviously we're not scientists, I want to caveat this a little bit, but we should at least think about a different maximization problem, not for society overall, which puts a big value on saving vaccine product. So you could cut the dose. If the elasticity of efficacy to the dose is less than 1, then you could get more total impact on the epidemic. Maybe focus on the first dose, maybe delay vaccinating those who've already been infected, who will have smaller benefits from this, so you can get the doses to other people. That's an issue we're working on now. Let me say a little bit about implications for international trade and cooperation. So first, there were a lot of concerns about vaccine nationalism and export bans, and that led to calls for locating production domestically. And in fact, countries did sort of tilt their investment towards domestic vaccines. In the event, the international trading system mostly held up, although we've just seen India saying it's not going to allow exports for a while. I think one conclusion is it's really important to reinforce this. You can actually get a lot of autarky is much, much worse than being able to have a diversified portfolio. And allowing international trade gets you a lot of the way towards the first best. Okay, a second concern is that programs like Operation Warp Speed would drive up prices. Would either drive up prices or worse, use up capacity. If you think that there's limits on prices, maybe it's just impossible for late movers to get the vaccine. I think a lot of the public discussion, the idea was people were assuming the supply was pretty inelastic, and then they focused on the negative externalities of, say, Operation Warp Speed or ordering all this vaccine, negative externalities in other countries. And sure, that could be there. But I think one of the things our analysis brings out is to the extent that certainly in the long run, but perhaps even in the relatively short run, there's some elasticity of supply. And then there can actually be positive externalities of contracts for capacity. If you structure the contract to say you have to install capacity, that capacity eventually becomes available for others. So for example, if you go back to if we had 137 million doses of capacity in the US per month, and we were done by March, well, then the rest of the world could benefit from that. I think the actual capacity turned out to be much larger than many thought possible, suggesting there's some elasticity. Okay. We'll never know whether next externalities were net positive or net negative in this case, but what we can know is that for the next pandemic, you want that supply elastic. You want supply to be elastic. Now, there are a bunch of specialized inputs that go into manufacturing vaccines: bioreactors, delivery devices like glass vials, adjuvants. If we can expand the supply chain capacity, or if we could stockpile the intermediate inputs for vaccines, that can be done over time. That should be quite elastic. That's going to be directly valuable because it means you could ramp up capacity to much higher levels if we have another pandemic. So that's directly valuable, but it also would help address some of these international problems, because if you make the supply of vaccine elastic, then you don't have these negative externalities from countries ordering vaccine that people were talking about, and rather you have the positive externalities that more capacity may eventually benefit other countries. But you also reduce the temptation to seize supplies and say we're not going to allow exports. You also reduce temptation to inefficiently race to secure supply because the price is less than the social value, and you think there are going to be shortages, so you grab to get it for you rather than for another country. So we think it would be very valuable to put in a lot of supply chain capacity to stockpile the intermediate inputs. But to get to the efficient level, that's if we think that there's going to be social constraints on pricing during emergencies. The market won't do that, because the people, the efficient price at some level would have to be enormous during the emergency. So if that's not going to happen, if there's uncertainty about whether that would happen, you should be subsidizing this up front. So I think that's a very important lesson for future policy.
Michael, you have about 4 minutes left.
Great. I think I'm on my last slide. Now, we argued that international trade can get you a lot of the way towards where you should be. Countries can order vaccines from suppliers around the world. However, there have been calls for much more central coordination, and the extreme for globally centralized procurement. One of our results was that the nationally optimal investment differs dramatically across countries. And we showed you the US numbers. It's optimal even certainly for middle income, but even for low income countries to do some at-risk investment. But the number of candidates they invest in and the quantity of each is lower. And that means if you did have a centralized system with vaccine allocation proportional to population, which obviously generates the huge benefit from a health perspective of every country can vaccinate their vulnerable early on. That is just very far from incentive compatible for high income countries. And, at least my judgment, I don't want to speak for the group, is this is not just an issue of, we're in a particular period of nationalism right now. I think even in normal times, countries are probably not going to agree to a centralized system with vaccine allocation proportional to population. If you want to get to incentive compatibility, you need at least some flexibility for countries to set their own investment levels, given how the nationally optimal levels differ. Now, you could still have centralized procurement. Everybody could pay into a central fund and then they could buy. What are the advantages of that? Well, one advantage might be they could use monopsony power to design procurement contracts to hold down vaccine prices. But, prices haven't gone through the roof anyway. So it's not clear it's really needed for that. I think the key obvious reason why you would want some sort of global cooperation is to address the needs of the lower income countries, both for humanitarian reasons and for infectious disease externality reasons. And what we've seen with COVAX is a focus on getting at least 20% of doses, or doses for 20% of the population for the most vulnerable to low-income countries. They don't yet have enough money for that, but that's I think that logic is a valid one. There are other possible gains. There could be doing things globally. You could have some insurance. Countries don't know who's going to be hit, rather than everybody building up their own stockpile, procuring the optimal amount for their country. If you can insure, then you can direct the vaccine if it hits some places more than others. Maybe there are economies of scale and planning. Maybe Bolivia doesn't want to work out within its own health ministry exactly. Their needs will be similar to other countries, and there's some role for centralized procurement. I think the other big thing that I would focus as a case where international cooperation might be useful, although probably can do a bit just nationally, is investment in supply chain and in these intermediate inputs so we're prepared for the next pandemic. So yes, our summary would be, it's good that we ordered in advance. We should have done even more. We should still do it now. We should try and get more out of our existing vaccine supply, and we should prepare for the next pandemic by building up stockpiles and investing in supply chain. Thanks.